Lamech was born into a family marked by a difficult past. He was a descendant of Cain, the man who brought the first stain of blood into the world. Amid this heavy inheritance, Lamech's life began in a time of expansion. Families grew, cities emerged, and humanity seemed to flourish. But behind this progress, something dark took deep root. His father, Methuselah, was a man who inherited Cain's legacy not only in blood, but also in choices. The stories of previous generations were told with a mixture of awe and reverence, but always carried the weight of a curse that never completely dissipated. Lamech grew up hearing these stories. Perhaps he felt the weight of that legacy from an early age, or perhaps he decided that his family's past would not be a prison, but a step towards something greater. He lived in a time when men began to see the world as something they could shape with their own hands. The land was exploited with creativity, but also with greed. Cities grew like crooked trees, full of life, but with roots that sought something deeper and insatiable. Lamech, however, would not be an ordinary man in this land who yearned for advancement. He would bring something new to his lineage, something that would be engraved forever. Subscribe to the channel for more exciting biblical stories and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any videos. As the world around him rapidly changed, Lamech also shaped his own trajectory. And, by standing out as someone who not only went with the flow, but also commanded it, he began to follow a path that would place him as a milestone in his generation. Lamech was not a man who was content to live like others. From a young age, he seemed to carry with him an ambition that went beyond what was expected. He observed the world with different eyes, seeing opportunities where others only saw everyday life. It wasn't long before his fame began to spread, not only among his own lineage, but also among those who lived in the surrounding lands. However, what really began to differentiate Lamech was the choice he made. Something unprecedented until then. He took 2 wives, Ada and Zillah. This decision was not just a fact, but a reflection of Lamech's personality. He wanted more. It was not enough to be a descendant of Cain, someone marked by an ancient history. He wanted to leave his own mark, one that was so grand it could resonate for generations. His choice to take 2 wives represented at the same time his power and his desire to stand out, to show that he was above the conventions of that time. Ada and Zillah, his wives, also bore names that seemed to resonate with greater meanings. Ada was graceful, with a presence that captivated everyone around her, while Zillah had a serene strength, like a firm stone in the middle of a current. Together, they were not only Lamech's companions, but also witnesses to his ambition and, in some ways, accomplices in his desire to shape something new in the world. From this union, Lamech's family began to grow. His sons, Jabal, Jubal, and Tubal-Cain, would not be common. Each of them seemed to carry a spark of something new, something that was beginning to change the course of the world in which they lived. Time passed, and Lamech, with his imposing character and his unusual family, continued to build his legacy. But there was something about Lamech that went beyond what was seen on the surface. He carried within him a restlessness, a fire that burned in his soul and seemed to grow as the days progressed. It was then that he spoke words that would echo like a mystery throughout the generations. A song, short and direct, but full of hidden meanings, was addressed to his wives, Ada and Zillah. With a firm, almost solemn voice, Lamech said, "Listen to me, Ada and Zillah, listen to what I'm going to say. I killed a man for hurting me, a young man for striking me. If Cain will be avenged 7 times, Lamech will be avenged 70 times, times 7. The words, filled with strength and a strange mixture of pride and defiance, left everyone around silent. But what exactly did Lamech mean? Were his words an outburst about something that had happened, or a metaphor for something bigger? Had he really killed someone, or was he just exaggerating to demonstrate his own strength? The truth is that no one knew for sure. What was known was that this song with its rhymes and intensity, symbolized a change. It was a milestone in the way man saw his own relationship with the world and with God. Lamech's words also carried a dark irony. As he quoted Cain, the ancestor who lived under the shadow of divine punishment, it seemed as if he himself was defying any punishment. It was as if Lamech had decided that he was above consequences, above the invisible laws that governed the destinies of men. But Lamech's words were not just a reflection of his ego. They were a harbinger, a sign of something to come, something that no one could yet fully predict. As Lamech's song continued to echo, his words, while mysterious, were overshadowed by his family's accomplishments. Ada and Zillah, his wives, gave birth to children who seemed marked by something special, almost as if each of them carried a fragment of the changing world. They were children who not only lived in the world, but who shaped it with their hands and minds, leaving their own marks. Jabal, Ada's firstborn, was the one who paved the way for something completely new. He was called the father of those who dwell in tents and keep livestock, but this was much more than a title. Jabal transformed the way people viewed nomadism, livestock farming, and the relationship with the land. He didn't just tend flocks. He created a way of life, a system, a way of coexisting with creation that mixed practicality and purpose. His brother Jubal, on the other hand, seemed to hear the sound of the wind differently. He was the first to play the harp and flute, instruments that did not exist until then. Music flowed from his hands as if by magic, filling the fields and cities with melodies that no one could forget. It was something that spoke to the soul, that gave voice to the invisible, and Jubal became the father of all who sought to translate the world into sounds. And then there was Tubal-Cain, son of Zillah, the most audacious of all. He mastered fire and metal, forging tools of bronze and iron as if the elements responded to his will. In his hands, metal came to life, transforming into weapons, tools, and symbols of power. Tubal-Cain was not just a craftsman. He was a creator of possibilities, someone who made the impossible real. The world that Lamech helped shape seemed to pulse with life. There was progress, innovation, and new sounds filling the air, but also a restlessness, like a storm about to brew on the horizon. Among the tents erected by Jabal, the melodies created by Jubal, and the metals forged by Tubal-Cain, something subtle began to emerge, a pride that grew like a tree with deep roots. It was an inordinate confidence in the strength of one's own hands, a belief that man could build, dominate, and win without looking at the sky. Lamech was the center of it all, the symbol of a generation that seemed invincible. His words in the song were not forgotten, rather they were repeated as a reminder of his strength. But there was a bitter irony to it all. The stronger Lamech felt, the more he and his family moved away from something essential. The world they built with so much zeal began to reveal cracks that not even Tubal-Cain's skill could repair. Violence, once contained in distant stories of Cain and Abel, now seemed to spread like an out-of-control fire. The pride that made them creative also made them arrogant, and disputes for power and dominance began to grow. Lamech, with his strength and imposing words, not only watched, but, in a way, led this movement. He was a leader, yes, but a leader who walked a dangerous path, one where divine justice seemed increasingly distant. Meanwhile, Jubal's music continued, now mixed with the sounds of Tubal-Cain's forges and the shouts of the disputes that intensified between the peoples. What was once harmony began to sound like chaos. And in the midst of it all, Lamech, the man who had promised revenge 70 times 7, seemed increasingly embroiled in a plot beyond his control. Lamech's days were set in a world where the line between progress and decay became increasingly blurred. From the outside, it seemed that humanity was experiencing a boom, new inventions, music that touched the heart, tools that changed the way we lived. But inside, people were further from God than ever before. It was a world where violence became common and greed began to shape relationships. There was a sense of urgency in the air, as if something invisible was approaching. Lamech, with his powerful voice and commanding presence, seemed to feel this too, but he refused to let it paralyze him. He clung to the strength of his family, the talents of his children, as if this could shield him against any threat. Jabal continued to expand his herds and build new ways of inhabiting the land, while Jubal made his instruments echo in celebrations that seemed at times to silence a collective anxiety. Tubal-Cain in turn worked tirelessly, creating weapons and tools that were both a blessing and a curse. It was as if the iron in his hands had its own will, something uncontrollable. However, corruption in the hearts of men began to grow at an alarming rate. Disputes previously silent now became openly violent. Tubal-Cain's tools, intended for construction, were increasingly used for destruction. What should have been a prosperous world now seemed to be taken over by shadows, and Lamech's legacy, once a source of pride, began to be questioned by those around him. But Lamech did not back down. On the contrary, he reaffirmed his position with the words that had already become his landmark. If Cain will be avenged 7 times, Lamech will be 70 times 7. Time seemed to carry a weight that no one could ignore. The once peaceful nights were now filled with sounds that reflected both the greatness and decay of humanity. Jubal's pipes sounded like a lament amid the chaos, while the sound of Tubal-Cain's hammering in the forges echoed like thunder in distant lands. The fields, once calm under Jabal's care, now seemed stained with strife and blood. Everything that had been built by Lamech's lineage began to reveal a price that no one was willing to pay. At the center of it all, Lamech maintained his imposing posture, like a king without a throne, ruling through pure charisma and strength. He believed he was unshakable, invincible. His words about revenge and power continued to be repeated among men, almost like a mantra. Some admired him, others feared him, but everyone knew he was not someone to be ignored. There was something about him, a mixture of strength and desperation, that seemed to attract and repel people at the same time. However, even with all his confidence, there were times when Lamech seemed distant, almost lost in his own thoughts. Perhaps he realized, even if he didn't admit it, that the foundation upon which he had built his life was beginning to crack. His words, once spoken so firmly, now sounded more like an attempt to convince himself than the world around him. Meanwhile, the world continued to transform. The innovations brought by their children changed people's lives in profound ways, but they also had consequences that no one could predict. Tools became weapons, melodies were lost in cries of conflict. What was prosperity was now mixed with a feeling of restlessness. And in the midst of this scenario, something invisible seemed to be lurking, silently growing, preparing to emerge. Lamech could feel it, even if he didn't understand it. Something was about to happen, something no man could prevent. Lamech's days seemed increasingly heavier, as if the very air around him was charged with something invisible but palpable. He was a man who did not bend easily, but even the strongest can sense when something is out of control. His family, once a symbol of innovation and power, now seemed to be at the center of a whirlwind that no one could contain. The disputes, the conflicts, the choices, everything seemed to be building up to something that went beyond what anyone could have predicted. Tubal-Cain's forges continued to work, spitting sparks that lit up the night sky like tiny falling stars. But the shine of the metal it created carried an unsettling paradox. What it was designed to build could also destroy. Iron and bronze tools passed from hand to hand, transforming into weapons in moments of tension. Jubal's songs still echoed, but what once brought harmony now seemed a sound lost amid the growing chaos. Even the fields of Jabal, where herds still multiplied, were not free from the impact of human greed and pride. Lamech observed all this with a mixture of pride and concern. He knew his lineage had changed the world, but something inside whispered that maybe the change wasn't just for the good. His words, that song that declared his strength and his revenge, now seemed to take on a new weight, almost like a prophecy of something greater. But if it worried him, he never let it show. His posture remained firm, his gaze always challenging. As chaos grew all around, a new story began to intertwine with that of Lamech, one that came from a distant but equally significant lineage. On the other side of this narrative, there were the descendants of Seth, the third son of Adam and Eve, born after the tragedy between Cain and Abel. While Lamech and his sons shaped the world with iron, fire, and sound, Seth's descendants sought something different. They did not build cities or create weapons, but they called on the name of the Lord, keeping alive a connection that seemed increasingly distant in the hearts of humanity. It was an almost poetic contrast. On the one hand, a lineage that created tools and ruled by force, and on the other, one that walked humbly, seeking divine guidance. But these two stories could not coexist without touching each other. As Seth's descendants continued on their way, his presence was like an uncomfortable reminder of something Lamech and his lineage had left behind. And even though they never crossed paths directly, the shadows of each lineage's choices began to project themselves onto each other. Seth's descendants spoke of the need to seek God's justice and goodness, while Cain's lineage seemed increasingly certain that they could shape the world with their own hands. And so, while Seth's descendants sought heaven, Lamech and his family dug their roots deeper into the earth. The songs of Jubal, the herds of Jabal, and the metal of Tubal-Cain were milestones of progress that stood out against the reverent simplicity of the other lineage. But there was something that connected these two paths, something that began to emerge as a great conflict between what men wanted to build and what God had planned for the world. Lamech, however, didn't seem to care about this. He remained steadfast in his vision of a world that was shaped by force. However, as the days passed, the consequences of so many choices began to form a storm, and this storm was getting closer and closer. The world around Lamech seemed to be on the boil. The winds carried rumors of violence and unrest, as if the entire earth was groaning under the weight of human choices. Cain's lineage, now represented by the legacy of Lamech, continued to prosper materially, but the spiritual void was impossible to ignore. There was a feeling that everything that was being built, cities, tools, music, could not fill the absence of that lost bond with the Creator. Lamech, with his imposing presence, watched the outcome of his lineage with a mixture of pride and concern that he would never admit. Their children had transformed the world, bringing advances that seemed to challenge the very limits of creation. However, what he may not have understood was that each advance also had consequences. The iron in the hands of Tubal-Cain, so powerful to mold, now served to destroy. Jabal's tents, created for shelter, became fortresses in increasingly frequent wars. Even Jubal's melodies, which once enchanted hearts, began to be lost in echoes that could not be heard amid the noise of conflict. Meanwhile, the earth, worn down and corrupted by human actions, seemed to silently cry out for justice. Lamech, in his stance of strength, may not have realized that the cracks forming around him were not just in the ground, but in the very foundation of his lineage. And although he had proclaimed his revenge 70 times 7, something greater than any revenge was approaching, something that no man could control or stop. The skies, which had remained silent for so long, now seemed dark and heavy, as if holding a secret about to be revealed. What Lamech and his generation didn't know was that the world they had shaped with so much effort was about to be shaken by something that would forever change the history of humanity. And so, as the glow of the forges faded and the songs lost their melody, destiny approached, bringing with it lessons that would echo through all generations. Lamech's world has reached its breaking point. The heavens finally opened, not with the blessings that men might have expected, but with the rain of judgment that no one could stop. The corruption and violence that had spread like a shadow across the land found their answer in divine justice. What Lamech and his lineage did not understand, or perhaps refused to see, was that progress without purpose, power without humility, and creation without connection to the Creator could not sustain a world that was supposed to reflect something greater. Lamech's words, so full of pride and defiance, now seemed to echo in the void, like distant memories of a man who thought he was invincible. He who proclaimed revenge 70 times 7 never understood that his strength and his achievements were not enough to escape the reach of divine justice. His life became a symbol of what happens when man tries to build a kingdom without God, when creation is worshipped more than the Creator. But the story of Lamech is not just a grim warning. It's also a lesson about the choices we make and the impact they have not only on our own lives, but on the generations that come after us. It teaches us that pride can be as destructive as any weapon, that strength without wisdom is weakness in disguise, and that the things we create with our hands only have true value when they are aligned with God's purposes. Lamech and his lineage disappeared in the waters of a flood that did not spare the arrogance of men. But the echo of his story remains, an invitation to reflect on what we are building with our lives. Does what we create reflect just our own desires or something bigger? Just like the rain that erased the world of Lamech, our choices will one day find their answer. And it is up to us to decide whether this response will be marked by destruction or by a legacy that is truly worthwhile. If you liked Lamech's story and want to continue following other stories of faith and overcoming, be sure to like this video and share it with those you love. And of course, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any new content. Together, let's explore more powerful lessons from the Bible.